Hello and welcome to the Friday Show, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me at the Hangout last night. I'm very excited to share my conversation with anti-racist writer and speaker Tim Wise today. Awesome, as always. That starts at just 8 minutes in after the news today. But let's get into yesterday's news. Lots to talk about, starting with the Justice Department's findings on the mass shooting in Uvalde in 2022. One of the big takeaways, children's lives may have been saved if officers had responded differently to a gunman who opened fire at the elementary school in Uvalde, Texas. The Justice Department concluded Thursday in its apparently scathing report on the 2022 mass shooting that killed 21 people, including 19 students. I figured I'd start with the most serious and horrible news story first, right at the top, just to get it out of the way. But yeah, they say a near total breakdown in policing protocols hindered the response to the school shooting. The DOJ blamed cascading failures of leadership, decision-making, tactics, policy, and training for a passive law enforcement response that allowed an 18-year-old gunman to remain inside the school for more than an hour before he was confronted and killed. The nearly 600-page report, compiled by 260 interviews, 14,000 documents and videos, is the most comprehensive assessment to date of a killing spree that continues to haunt the community, well, and the country, like it is haunting you right now just by me mentioning it. So a lot to look into on that, and the victims' families there are not done. I may be talking to somebody from Uvalde soon. Fighting has eased in northern Gaza, according to the New York Times. Israel's dialed back its military campaign in the northern Gaza Strip, where Israeli officials say their military succeeded in degrading Hamas's local battalions. Airstrikes are no longer as common, and many Israeli troops have pulled out of the area. Residents there said they can now walk around without the sound of guns or explosions. Oh, what a great achievement. Northern Gaza, though, largely in ruins. Entire neighborhoods rendered unrecognizable, and displaced Palestinians squatting in abandoned homes. Food is scarce. Few aid shipments are reaching the north. Makeshift markets have popped up with vendors selling what residents presume are stolen goods. In related news, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu appeared to rule out a post-war peace process that would lead to the establishment of a Palestinian state, and that will affect potential aid to Israel. Senate Democrats aggressively pushed back yesterday on the prime minister, saying that he informed the U.S. that he opposes a creation of the Palestinian state. Senator Chris Murphy, as a matter of fact, warned that Netanyahu's remarks could complicate delicate bipartisan negotiations in the Senate on a supplemental package that calls for military aid for Israel, coupled with immigration measures and aid for Ukraine. So it is about time that happened, and we'll see if anything happens vis-a-vis aid to Israel. You know it will, but this is high stakes, folks. Speaking of high stakes, ahead of tonight's deadline, Congress passed a bill that would prevent a partial government shutdown this weekend and keep federal funds flowing through March 1st and March 8th. The Democratic-led Senate voted 77-18 on final passage after considering a few amendments. Republican-led House soon followed suit, passing it by a vote of 314 to 108. Congratulations, Republicans. You actually kept the government open. Wow, that's surprising. A lot of people didn't think that was going to happen, did they, Kevin Richburg? Another big story, another radical moves in Texas. A federal appeals court on Wednesday blocked a Texas law that would require ratings from booksellers that deal with school libraries, agreeing with a lower court that found it unconstitutional. The Fifth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals, that one, said in a decision published Wednesday that the state could not violate the Constitution. Well, how about that? I'll be talking with Eric Siegel about that this weekend. And speaking of judges, a judge overseeing the federal election interference case against former President Donald Trump has rejected his request to hold special counsel Jack Smith and his office in contempt. It was always a ridiculous thing, but that is the decision. Oh, January 6th news. A Florida man was sentenced Wednesday to 5 years in prison for assaulting at least 6 Capitol police officers on January 6th. Including one officer said the attack had led him to retire early. Prosecutors said the man, Kenneth Bonowitz, 58, of Pompano Beach, Florida, in court papers, is one of the most violent of January 6 rioters. Well, guess what? Now he's going to jail for 6 years. So I think that's good news. And what else do I have for you? Let's see. U.S. forces on Thursday conducted a 5th strike against Iranian-backed Houthi rebel military sites in Yemen, as President Joe Biden acknowledged that the American and British bombardment had yet to stop the militants' attacks on vessels in the Red Sea that have disrupted global shipping. Newly released documents indicate that a U.S. genetic database had received a sequence of the coronavirus 2 weeks before it was made public by others. Lawmakers and independent scientists said that these new documents offer tantalizing new details about when and how scientists first tried to share those sequences globally, illustrating the difficulty the U.S. has with picking worrisome pathogens out of thousands of humdrum genetic sequences that are submitted to its repositories every day. So it's a pretty complicated story, but a big story that I wanted to mention here in the opening news segment. In Washington State, a judge said that the former president, Donald Trump, could remain on their state's primary ballot. So that's another state to reverse based on a judge's ruling. No huge surprise there. Reproductive rights groups are campaigning to establish a right to abortion in Missouri, the first state to officially outlaw abortion after Roe v. Wade was overturned. Saw some good reporting in the New York Times about that. And you know what? Those are your headlines. I've got to wrap it up because I have got to get on the road, taking the girls skiing today for the first time and probably for a while because Ava goes back to college this weekend. Oh my God, it's going to be so hard. Now, we've had a great break. I'm excited to take them skiing, and that is why I can't do a more comprehensive news segment with sound. I used to not do it at all on Friday, but I've done it the last couple weeks, and then I got this great email from Ryan Gilligheim or whatever his name is, but Ryan wrote, "It amazes me, Pete, that you host 5 podcasts a week, still personally answer listeners' emails. Thank you for what you're doing. You are my default news summary source." So there you go, Ryan. Thank you very much. It is an honor and a pleasure. I work real hard on the show each and every day to make it happen, and we'll keep trying to make it better and add to it and grow this podcast and this community. It was so great to see so many of you last night. I so appreciate you and your subscription and support. If you aren't supporting this commercial-free, ad-free podcast, go to patreon.com/Pete Dominic and sign up now. That would be huge. I'd love to see your new subscriptions come in today or tomorrow, over the weekend, whenever. That is the only way to keep this podcast going each and every day. So sign up now. All right, let's get to my guest. He is one of the best. I get him on probably almost every other week these days. I love talking to Tim Wise. He's one of the smartest people I know. He's also one of the most articulate, well-spoken people I know. He's an activist. He is a writer specifically when it comes to the topic of race. He's a consultant, and he's a friend. He's become a really good friend of mine. I love talking to Tim. I hope that you'll go subscribe to his work and get all of his books. He's simply one of the best people on race in America. At least that's how I see it. Go support him. Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, Threads, and everywhere else. And like I said, get the books and tell him I said hi, you said hi. Tell him you said hi on any of those platforms and reach out and let him know how much you appreciate him joining me. Here he is, ladies and gentlemen, one of the best, Tim Wise, today on Stand Up. And I've got one of my all-time favorite people to talk to, the king of wokeness, Mr. Woke, wokeified. A guy who knew that word before it got destroyed. Tim Wise, everybody. How are you, pal?
I'm doing all right. How about you?
I'm super woke. I'm feeling very woke and ready to take on whoever wants to argue about ignorance with you, because that's the new policy for Republicans. Everything that they don't like is simply woke. And what do you make of the rise of the destruction of that word? I mean, it's just so I don't know. It's sort of sad. Like, I never loved the way that white people use the word anyway. I always used to. You know, I was, as I'm sure you know, I was voted one of the 8 wokest white people that the Root magazine could name. I didn't know that.
Yeah, I was. I was actually number 8, though, which made me feel some kind of way because maybe it was alphabetical. I don't know what it was. It's sad you were. It's maybe because you weren't quoting enough rap lyrics like Ari Melber, who you had the subtlest, hilarious tweet about. You're like, I don't know. It's just weird. Yeah, I like Ari Melber. I really do. I like him a lot, but it's just he reads these, and I know he loves hip hop. Like, I know he does. He is a diehard hip hop head. He knows and appreciates the culture, but he reads the lyrics like a 55-year-old white man like me reading off a cue card. And it's just sort of like, well, who are you trying? Who are you trying to impress with that? He does it. And I like it when if Jim Carville's on like he was the other day, and I think he was just trying to troll him and make Jim Carville uncomfortable by quoting rap lyrics. I can appreciate it, but it's every night. It is like, or should be, a drinking game. But back to the woke thing. The Root named me one of the 8 wokest white people they knew, and I remember thinking, well, that was a nice accolade. And then the word got ruined. And first off, it was always sort of silly, right? Because if you can't even make a list with 10 people, what kind of list is that? Like, you got 8 woke white people. Yeah. You're like, well, we don't even have a 9 or 10, but we got 8 and this kid made it, and so now the word is ruined. And I only mention it sort of tongue in cheek because whatever will make those people on the right, hate me more is sort of what I'll do. But yeah, it's just interesting the way that they gravitated to that concept. And I think in this case, they did it on the right because that word is associated with young black people. And there's very few folks they dislike more than young black people. And so if they can, it's more effective than calling us politically correct, right? Because that term just doesn't have the automatic racial connotation. But everybody knows that when you talk about being woke, you're talking about black folks, and particularly young black folks. So you get in this sort of subtle racial coding, right? Dog whistling, which is what the right has always been super good at. So it's unfortunate, but it's par for the course,
Yeah, it is. And that's kind of where we're at today. So well said. Monday, I was thinking about talking to you earlier in the week or last week to have something to discuss in terms of civil rights on Martin Luther King Day. But that was obviously just Monday. And I wanted to just ask where you think that we are at, how you see his legacy and the legacy of the civil rights era, specifically as it relates to voting rights, because I think that we should simplify this issue. It's easier to message sometimes when we hear people like Nikki Haley and others, commentators, and sadly, people running for president and other higher office invoking Dr. King and talking about some of his rhetoric or some of his speeches, or saying things like, America is not a racist country, or slavery wasn't the root cause of the Civil War. It makes you realize how little either they understand or want to give credit to the legacy of the civil rights era when it comes to voting rights, because those voting rights have been repealed by the Supreme Court and gutted the Voting Rights Act. I feel like that's where we kind of should start and end when it comes to what it means to be racist or racism in America, specifically as it relates to that era. And I know I've talked to you about this before, but what do you think of kind of zeroing in on that, certainly this week when we think about his legacy?
Well, look, I mean, Dr. King was very clear about a couple of things. One was that indeed America was a racist country. Now, you might say, well, he didn't use those exact words. Well, he came awfully close. He said that America was poisoned to its soul by racism. Those are his words, not mine. Those are his words. And he uttered them in the last article that he ever wrote, which was published after his death in Playboy magazine, which I only know because I read it for the articles. And that's a joke that only old people like us will get. And he said that racism was as native to American soil as pine trees, buffalo grass, and sagebrush. So he was suggesting that it was intrinsically woven into the fabric of the country. That doesn't mean that everyone's a horrible racist. It doesn't mean there isn't hope, but it means that it is not an aberration, right? It was not some deviation from an otherwise racially ecumenical norm. It was the norm, racism, racial inequality. And in trying to address that, he made the right to vote among the most important things that he was fighting for. Arguably, as important as the Civil Rights Act was in 1964, the Voting Rights Act in 65 was arguably more so, because it was the ability to elect representatives, elect those who will govern you, which allow the enforcement of that first law in the first place. The Civil Rights Act itself isn't really enforceable over time if you're not able to vote for people who represent you. And so the goal of the civil rights movement has always been to expand the franchise, to make it easier for people to vote, not to make it harder, but to make it easier. And yet the modern Republican Party, which will quote him absolutely on MLK Day, always out of context. I've always really wanted to ask these folks if they could just tell me one book that they've read by Dr. King, and they can't Google it. They can't look at their phone. They have to know it off the top of their head. The answer is they haven't read any of Dr. King's works. They haven't listened to any of his speeches other than the I Have a Dream speech. And they didn't listen to the whole thing. They listened to one clip. It takes about 5 seconds to listen to. We know which one it is. And so what Dr. King was trying to do is make it easier to vote. Everything the Republicans do is to make it more difficult to vote, right? Whether that is onerous photo ID requirements, which have no correlation with making elections more secure. Because the reality is no one is going to vote, or at least not. I mean, I'm sure there are handfuls of people. You can't say no one. There's always a case there or somewhere, right? But very few people are going to go and risk imprisonment and a fine just so they can vote for someone in an election. That's just not common. And at least if it were common, they would do it through some other means. They would do it through absentee voting, where you're less likely to, come face to face with someone who might catch you. The idea that you're going to go to a precinct and not have and not have an ID and vote in somebody else's name. That's a stupid risk that you would take. What if that person already showed up and they've got a note there that says, that person already voted, or that person had already sent in an absentee ballot? Then you're going to be arrested. So people are not doing this. This idea that you've got some widespread need for photo identification when we didn't have that for years. We've talked about this before. We didn't need photo ID for secure elections until when did they start talking about that? After 2008. Well, what happened in 2008 that all of a sudden made these folks think, my goodness, we've got to really crack down on illegal voting? What, was there no illegal voting in 06 and 04 and 02 and 2000 in 98, 96, 94, 92? Not like we gotta have a problem. Oh, it's only when the black guy became president that all of a sudden you're like, and black turnout, was higher, I think, than white turnout in 2008. All of a sudden, that must be fraud. No, it was enthusiasm and excitement, but that scared the hell out of some people. So whether it's photo ID requirements, which really aren't necessary, and if we're going to do it, you should at least make it easy to get ID and free, and you ought to make sure that there is a standard identification that everybody can get really easily, but they don't want to do that. They want to cut down on early voting. And why? Well, we know why. Over in North Carolina, this was pretty infamous a few years ago when the state legislature asked the state officials to please let them know which identifications black people were least likely to have and which ones were white people most likely to have. And then once they got the answer from the state about that, they proceeded to pass a law that said you have to have this particular kind of ID. And it was always the ones that black people were more likely to lack. You have other states that said, well, you can't use a student ID. Because we know young people, they tend to vote increasingly for Democrats, especially if they're young.
Here is the Associated Press and, this is NPR. North Carolina judges struck down the state's latest voter identification law on Friday, agreeing with minority voters that Republicans rammed through rules tainted by racial bias as a way to remain in power. So it's not you saying it, it's not me saying it, it's a court saying it, and it's not a political court. Either. I mean,
that's a couple of courts in a row that have said it too, because a few years ago when this first came up, when the original attempt was struck down, they said that the legislature had targeted black voters with surgical precision. Right.
That's right. That's the
this
quote.
Is the kind of thing that and like I said, not only there, but in other states, they said you can't use student ID, but you can use your gun registration identification. Right, really? Right. Why? Like, again, why?
I don't think that's what Dr. King was. Yeah, I don't think Dr. King was talking about ID, much less the IDs that would be appropriate.
So and early voting's the same, right? We know that folks of color, working class folks, students, all of whom have lives that are sometimes, they got stuff going on. You might be working 2 jobs. You might be in class. If you're lower income, you might not be able to get off work on the day of the election. So you want to vote early. Well, they don't want those people to vote. And so it's no evidence that early voting is more likely to result in fraud. In fact, to be honest, there are probably fewer mistakes with early voting because it's spread out, over a couple of weeks. So it's usually not as chaotic at the polling place. But they just want to restrict the right to vote. And sometimes they're honest about it. Steve Bannon is on the record, as is Judson Phillips, who was a Tea Party leader, as is Ted Nugent, as are a number of right-wing reactionary spokespersons and talking heads saying that we ought to have civics tests. We ought to have a property requirement. Steve Bannon has said that you should have to be a property owner in order to vote. I mean, these are people who were doing everything opposite of what Dr. King believed in, and yet have the temerity to quote him. So that's where we are. We're at the silly stage of right-wing hypocrisy, where these are the same people who want to ban books about Dr. King in school libraries for fear that it might make white children and families feel bad, but they want to quote him out of context, act as if they are somehow acolytes of him. And at least in that regard, to be honest, I have more respect for Charlie Kirk, who this last week went off on some anti-MLK diatribe on his Twitter and said, we're going to expose, he was a Marxist, socialist, da-da-da-da-da. Like, I have more respect for him because at least he's critiquing Dr. King. Yes, he did believe in the redistribution of resources. He said so very clearly. Would he have called himself a Marxist? No, he wouldn't have, actually. He rejected that label for a number of reasons. He
also said a lot worse than that. He had a black conservative on, Vince Ellison, and they said all kinds of pretty terrible things about him, like that he encouraged rape. So they were clearly trying to
part. I don't respect that part, but I do respect the fact that I'd rather have a right winger admit that they detest the legacy of MLK. I would because that's where they were. Look, there was no more. There was no more major and an organ of conservatism and the far right in the 60s than the National Review magazine, right? The National Review was the organ of organized conservatism. And William F. Buckley and the folks at the National Review were clear that they had no support, no respect, no time at all for the civil rights movement. They blamed the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham in 1963. They speculated in the pages of the National Review that it might have been a crazed Negro who did that just to make segregationists look bad. Because, Bull Connor wouldn't look bad unless you set him up, apparently, in the eyes of William F. Buckley. And so if that's what the right was about, as horrific as that is, as grotesque as that is, I have more respect for that because at least you're admitting these ain't my people. MLK's not my people. Okay, fine. If that's the legacy, if you want to crap on the legacy of Dr. King and you want to say he's a terrible person, at least you're being consistent. That is actually preferable to trying to glom on to the legacy because you know that you need to do that in order to not sound like a flaming racist. Right. I have more respect for the people that are just like, I'm a flaming racist. Right. I'd prefer.
Sure. Sure. Would rather have you be honest with me than pretend that you like me is generally the feeling that most individuals have, much less folks that are members of, marginalized, historically discriminated groups. Just be honest, man. I'll even work with you. But as long as I know where you're coming from, that's what I hear a lot. Obviously, I think that's a pretty fair statement. What do you make of we get to the presidential campaign now? Vivek, I know you were a big Vivek fan, Tim Wise. I know you saw a lot of hope and potential in him. At the very last day or two before the Iowa caucuses, Donald Trump came for him.
Yeah,
which was interesting. And also the last couple of weeks came for Nikki Haley, specifically with the accusations of birtherism, I think. But just starting with Vivek, who has licked his boots, kissed his ass. People were saying, he was trying to be vice president, never hardly ever criticized Trump. Trump came for him, said he's not MAGA. He's not one of us type of thing, and similar things about Nikki Haley. And then, of course, Vivek quits and falls in line and then appears with Donald Trump, shakes his hand as an awkward thing. I don't know if you saw where it almost looked like they were about to kiss, Vivek and Trump. Did you see that video? It was hilarious.
Yeah.
What do you make of those people? What is it called?
Well, Vivek is a grifter. He's always been a grifter. If folks will look into his background of how he made his money, he made his money grifting. And he's like most tech bros, man. It's just this culture of tech broism that where the ego gets way ahead of the actual skill set. And so that's where he's coming from. And he's just like Ted Cruz. You can insult Ted Cruz's wife, call her ugly. He'll continue to support you if you're Donald Trump because he hopes he's going to get a job with Trump. I guess Vivek thinks that he will somehow get some kind of job as well with Trump if Trump were to win. And so he's trying to get back in his good graces. Now, as for Trump, why did he turn on Vivek and Nikki Haley? Well, I think he finally realized, oh, shit, these are not white people. Like I really, for some reason, I wasn't paying attention. I guess I just was not paying attention. And I've discovered they're not MAGA, by which I mean they are brown. Right. And so now it's like, oh, Nikki's name is Nimrata, or I need to make sure I remind people of that, just like I reminded people of Barack Obama's middle name, because we're going to play this game that these people are not as American as those of us who are MAGA, and we know what that means. So we'll use them. We'll use them as long as they stay in line. They don't say anything critical. But I think in Vivek's case, he said like one minorly critical thing. And that was all it took for Trump to get set off. And of course, Nikki Haley has said many critical things, and that's all it took for him to get set off, because not only is there the sort of implicit racism of birtherism, but there's also the sexism that is so much a part of who Donald Trump is. Yeah. And there's just the Donald Trumpism of who Donald Trump is, which is to say that if you say anything about him at all, like if you were to just simply sort of casually say that he shits his pants on a regular basis and it smells terrible, this is what I've heard. People are talking. If you say that, he is going to be in full fight or flight mode and is gonna fire back. It's just what he does. It's because, this is a guy that told us he's the same person he was when he was 5 and wanted to like punch the teacher in the face or whatever. You just can't. This is somebody who literally told the judge, what was it, either today or yesterday, when the judge said, you can't control yourself. And he said, you can't. It's just sort of like, I know you are, but who am I? It's just like a Pee-wee harmonization of the courtroom.
Maybe you're the one. Maybe it's your fault. Yeah. Have you ever thought about maybe you're the one who likes to grab people? So what do you call Senator Mike Lee, Senator Marco Rubio, Senator Ted Cruz, Senator Lindsey Graham, Vivek, and others who Donald Trump has absolutely, you just touched on this about Ted Cruz's, I think, family and his father, his wife, just horrible to. Said the most personal attack. Said Ted Cruz's father was part of the JFK assassination. Basically said his wife was ugly. What is it like? Because that's outside of politics. I don't know that kind of man. I wouldn't ever be friends with that kind of person that would on one day be rightfully and seriously, specifically critical of a person. And then just a few days, months, or years later, Marco Rubio, Mike Lee just endorsed Donald Trump after they said he was the most dangerous liar. He would destroy the party. What are those people? What do you call that besides just naked opportunism? How can anyone support someone?
I think it's mostly naked opportunism. I think there is a character, there is a personality type that, frankly, in this modern era, and it's sad, maybe it's always been this way, there is a dominant personality type among people who want to be president and who want to be elected officials. And that is that they really, they like themselves a lot and they want power. Now, not everybody's abusive with that power. And not everybody who's like that, by the way, is a Republican or a conservative. There's a certain amount of ego, right? There's an ego need that is fed when you want to be the president, which Marco Rubio wanted to be, Ted Cruz wanted to be. I mean, you've got to have a little bit of an ego to even think you could do that gig, right? And so if you see a path to power, and that path to power involves licking the boots of someone like Donald Trump, then you will do it. Now, there are other people who may kiss up to him for the same reasons maybe Chris Christie did, right? Which was he thought, and I'm just going to take Christie at his word for a minute, which is not something I have a history of doing. But for the sake of argument, let's say that he really thought I can restrain his worst impulses. Maybe that's post facto rationalization, but I could see somebody doing that. I'm sure he had cabinet officials who did that. There were people that would sort of kiss his ass and stroke his ego and stick with him even when he said horrible stuff because they felt like, holy crap, if I bolt, he's going to be completely out of control. What I think we've learned now, though, is that even if that were a potential rationale for sucking up to him, right, to try to get in his good graces and then distract him with some shiny object when he decides to like drop nuclear weapons or something. The reality is nothing is restraining this man. Nothing is going to restrain him. So if that was a rationale, it's gone now. Now it's just bootlicking for the sake of power. And in the case of Ted Cruz, he wants to make sure that he doesn't alienate that magnified base, which he's going to need for reelection.
Right.
Ted Cruz is not universally beloved in the state of Texas, and he doesn't want there to be any possibility that he could lose that election. And if he angers the MAGA base by not kissing Donald Trump's ass, because he knows that's a huge portion of the party. It is the majority of the party now. It's not a plurality. It's not a small subgroup. It is the base of the Republican Party. And in a state like Texas, you got to have those folks. You wouldn't necessarily need that if you were an elected official in the Republican Party, maybe in another part of the country. Connecticut had a long history of elected Republican officials that tended to be more moderate to conservative. You wouldn't have to be that. But in Texas and in Florida, or, or Arizona, where the GOP is makes Barry Goldwater look like Angela Davis, right? Like they're going to have to play that game or else they're going to lose power. And they hate that thought more than anything. But that's what's so pathetic. It's pathetic to actually like Donald Trump and support him anyway. But if you're just doing it so that you can keep your gig by appealing to just the worst people in the country. The worst people in the country. There's something really fundamentally wrong with your moral calibration, and that's where Cruz and Rubio.
Well said. You shared this Atlantic article, speaking of which, about his base. You're talking about them. It's titled, "Trump Wants Revenge, and So Did His Base," and you quoted it. Exactly correct. The media refuses to admit it, but the MAGA faithful are mean, vengeful people. Not decent, misunderstood, and, quote, left behind people, but folks who are not decent. And we would do well to be clear on this so others know the threat they pose. So you're talking about these folks. You've been using this kind of language to talk about the MAGA faithful for a long time. I mean, I don't disagree with you, but it hasn't changed. It's only gotten worse. This time, only about 50,000 of them came out for Trump in a cold night in Iowa, though. And you have to wonder if, while it's hard to believe he's maintained so much support, that he is still, at the same time, lost a lot of support in certain places, including like Iowa.
Yeah, he has. Look, there are people who were MAGA 4 years ago and 8 years ago who have, in fact, begun to look for the off ramps. You know, they're trying to find ways off of that interstate. And for those folks, or exits on the train, right? And for those folks, obviously, that's not who I'm talking about when I say that they're the most awful people in the world, because people can change and they can get it together and they can come to their senses. But if you are one of those people who is not only not looking for an off ramp, you're feeding coal into the engine of the train, right? You're these people. I mean, there was a clip yesterday, I'm sure you saw it, of, you know, MAGA folks being interviewed at these rallies and being asked point blank, if you had a choice between Donald Trump as a dictator, not just for one day, like he jokes about, but for 4 years, like an actual dictator, jailing his enemies, shredding the Constitution, or Joe Biden for 4 years as just a president, what would you prefer? And they didn't hesitate. It wasn't like they had to think about it, or they said, oh, he doesn't mean that about being a dictator. He would never be a dictator. That's a stupid question. They could have answered it that way, but they didn't. The way they answered it was, oh, I'd rather have Trump as a dictator. In fact, one guy was like, sometimes, it's like when you're a kid, you just need to be spanked. You need to have somebody in authority sort of set you straight when you're doing wrong.
I watch those interviews of Trump supporters, and I'm always a little bit critical because as a person who, I don't know if you know this, but I was a professional man on the street guy for a long time. And you can self-select, you can edit just the dumbest, worst people. But I don't believe that there are reasonable people giving reasonable answers. And I think that we should go all the way with asking the Trump supporters. I want one of these very funny people who go to these rallies to ask a Trump supporter, listen, would you allow Trump to have sex with your wife? And I'm not really kidding. I mean, that was David Koresh's deal. At what point will they say, no, he can't do that?
Right.
That is too far. And I'm not sure in the kind of cult thinking of these people that go to these rallies and buy his swag and still support him, even after he's been convicted of rape in a civil trial, as we're seeing come back up. I think they're okay with it. I think they'd be fine with it.
I know they'd be okay with it in the villages because they like to swing down there. Those MAGA folks in the villages are all about the please, by all means, come sleep with my wife stuff. So I have no doubt that
how dare
if you ask
disparage?
I know the answers you're going to get. Now, please don't get me wrong. I know people in the villages who are not like that. I'm just talking about the hardcore MAGA villages folks. And so I know the answer. I know what the answer would be. But I do think, I think that these folks have told us over and over and over again, and it is so funny to watch the mainstream corporate media try to deny the plain language that is being used by these people to make it seem like, well, they're frustrated about the economy or the price of gas, or they're upset about supply chain disruptions, or they're upset about feeling left behind and ignored. We are interviewing them in their frickin' diners like every 6 months to find out what it is that they're thinking about, something we never do for Biden voters. We never do for Democrats. We didn't do it for Obama voters. Nobody went and asked people, why, what is it about Obama that you like? Or what is it about Biden that you like? Or what is it about the Democrats that inspires you? But with Trump, it's like, gosh, I wonder what it's about. And then they're like, we'd like for him to be a dictator. Oh, I bet it's the oil prices, right? I bet it must be the gasoline, right? No, it's actually that I like the whole poisoning the blood thing. Oh, it must be the price of tomatoes has gone up and you're upset. No, it's the poisoning the blood thing, and it's just, and how many times do you have to say that I'm a horrible, horrible person before someone is willing to say, you're a horrible person. You're just a horrible person. And there's plenty of time to get off that train if you're not. But if you're going to keep riding it all the way to the final destination there, then be prepared to be called what you're going to be called, and don't whine about it. Again, be Charlie Kirk. Just be an asshole, just admit that's who you are, rather than try to act like you're a decent person or a Christian, and say and do the things that these folks say and do.
You could be Christian and pro-authoritarian, and it would actually track. To be fair.
Oh, it absolutely would track.
Democracy and Christianity.
I'm just talking about the way in which they talk about, immigrants and the stranger and all the things that we know what Jesus said about those things. Not that they've ever cared about what Jesus said, because they don't actually read what Jesus said. They read, what their pastor says about what Jesus said. And then when you try to, I think it was, who was it that said that? This was in the news a couple months ago too, that someone was talking to their parishioners about, the Sermon on the Mount. And the parishioners were saying, yeah, but that's too soft. That doesn't work anymore. I'm like, oh, okay. All right. So the forgiveness thing, the turn the other cheek thing, the welcome the stranger, what you did to the least of these, you did unto me. I mean, all of these things that I shouldn't even know as a Jew, but I learned it somewhere. Like that stuff is too soft. It's too weak. The Jesus thing doesn't work. So now we make Trump a virtual deity. It's fascinating. If I believed in the Antichrist, it wouldn't be hard to find Trump as being the Antichrist. Like, it tracks with everything that the Bible says the Antichrist will be, and that believers will fall for it. And obviously I don't believe that. But if I did, I would be like really nervous right now, and I'd be checking his hairline for the little 666 that was on Damien's scalp in The Omen.
Don't check his palms. Have you seen the latest?
Oh, the syphilis on his hands or whatever. Yeah.
James Carville said it was like he had red marks on his hand that people were saying it was blood when he walked out of court, and they, speculated as to what it was. I think it was probably Sharpie, but
well, I don't know. One of the things looked like a pus bubble. And people were saying it was syphilis. Like it was literally, I don't know. I don't know what syphilis looks like, either from experience or research. I'm just saying that's what I'm hearing. People are saying it might be syphilis.
Sir, you might want to keep that. You might want to keep that right hand in your pocket, sir.
Yes.
Let me ask you about, just real quick, Nikki Haley, who's still in the race somehow. She is really screwed up every time she's been even remotely asked about race or American history. Of course, there was a couple weeks ago when she was asked what was the cause of the Civil War, and she avoided everything about slavery. And then she said the other day that America has never been a racist country. Then moments later, she said when she was little, she suffered some racism as a little brown girl growing up in South Carolina. But America's never been a racist country. That was really tough to take, given the fact that she herself got a history lesson just a week before that about slavery, admitted that slavery was the cause of the Civil War, has plenty of opportunities, and could say, listen, we were a lot worse, and America was much more racist, but we've made, like, she could have said any number of things, but she just simply said, America has never been a racist country. And I know that I thought of your head and it exploding everywhere because of the way that you can explain this.
It's amazing how they fumble these easy questions, but I know why, and I'll tell you why they do it in a second. Yeah. But look, the Civil War thing, she fumbled that one because she knows there's a significant chunk of the Republican base now that eschews the history of the Republican Party, which is founded in anti-slavery, right? And is anti-Confederate. Now the neo-Confederates are all within the right-wing orbit, all within conservatism, all within the Republican Party. So she couldn't disrespect the legacy of the Confederacy unless she wanted to get in trouble with that base. So she tried to avoid it, and then she soft pedaled it. And, when she backtracked, the stuff about about America never being a racist country, I know what she's trying to say. She's trying to have it both ways. She's trying to say, look, yes, of course, there are individual racists. There have always been individual racists. And she as a child experienced some of that, but that the country itself has never been racist. Now, I guess you could make an argument that countries as these sort of corporate entities, large entities, cannot be racist in the way individuals can because they can't have consciousness, they don't have intent, et cetera, et cetera. But that's a very, very debate tactic way to define racism, right? If you understand racism as a set of structures, as a set of institutional practices, which It doesn't take a left-wing critical race theorist to tell you that's what you ought to think. Anytime you have a word that ends with ISM, it's a system. That's just grammar. That's not Tim Wise. That's not CRT. That's not wokeness. That's grammar. Capitalism, socialism, communism, fascism, authoritarianism, and racism, as just a few examples, are not just things that people believe in. Yeah, you can be a capitalist, you can be a socialist, but you can also have capitalism and socialism as structural things. So to say America has never been racist makes zero sense, because the policies, the practices, the procedures, the laws of the land enshrined racism, both interpersonal and systematic, against black and brown peoples. We've talked about this before. It wasn't just enslavement. The very first substantive piece of legislation that the Congress passed after the Constitution was ratified was the Naturalization Act of 1790, which existed only for one reason, and that was to say who could be a citizen of the United States. And they said all free white persons and only free white persons could be citizens. So to say that we were never a race, if you want to say we're not now, then fine. We can have that discussion. We can have that debate. We can disagree, whatever. But to say that we were never racist is to tell me that you did not pay attention in 8th grade history class, or that you did, but that you have to elide the truth and cover up the truth for your political motivations and purposes, which is what I think is going on. Nikki Haley's not a fool. She knows the history. She was raised in South Carolina. You can't not know it. South Carolina was the most Confederate of Confederate states. They were threatening to secede like 30 years before anybody else. They were threatening to leave like way before the other states wanted to. They were always the ones at the forefront of that, and she knows it, right? People in Texas know it. They know why they seceded. They know what the history of enslavement is. They are very aware of it, but they are also afraid that if they are honest about it, that they are going to hurt themselves with a base that wants to ignore that reality, paper over that reality, and tell us to just forget about that history. Because if we're honest about it, look, good people realize that if you acknowledge the history of racism in this country, just logic will tell you, if you acknowledge the deep systemic history that the King quote that I gave you at the outset speaks to, then you're morally obligated to do something about it. Yes. Right? People of goodwill would be morally obligated to address that legacy. So in order not to have to address it, you have to deny it. There's a logic to everything they're doing. It's just an evil logic.
I wanted to ask you to react to you're a sports fan. You like football. And yesterday, the New England Patriots hired their first black coach ever. Robert Kraft is sitting there next to the new coach. I can't find his name.
Jared Mayo.
Jared Mayo. He's a former linebacker, I guess, played for the Patriots for a long time. So the owner knows him well, knows his character. And Jared Mayo, well, let's listen to him in his own words, Tim.
I do see color, because I believe if you don't see color, you can't see racism. And whatever happens, black, white, disabled person, I've always, even someone with disabilities, I always, for the most part, people are like, when they're young, they kind of make the spot hot. Younger people know what that means. But what I would say is, like, no, I want you to be able to go up to those people and really understand those people. So it goes back to whatever it is, black, white, yellow, it really doesn't matter, but it does matter, so we can try to fix a problem that we all know we have.
People are giving him a lot of credit for giving an answer that should always be given. It seems pretty obvious. What did he say, and why does it matter? And what's the larger, what do you think is a larger conclusion about New England finally hiring a black coach because of, Boston?
Yeah, well, it's a lot to unpack. I mean, Jared Mayo basically was saying that you have to notice color, because if you don't notice color, you can't notice racism. It's another way of saying what the great civil rights legend Julian Bond used to say. He said, that to be blind to color is to be blind to the consequences of color, and especially the consequences of being the wrong color in America. So that's really what Mayo was saying, too. And what I really appreciated about him saying it isn't just that it's, I think, self-evidently true, but he said it in response to something the owner, Robert Kraft, had said, which was, it was nice what Kraft said. He made the point, look, I hired this man not because he's black, but because he's the best person for the job. I get it. And there's a very good chance that he is. He's certainly well qualified for the job. But I will say this, that bothered me a little bit when Kraft said that, because, there's nothing wrong with looking for excellence and diversity. They are not polar opposites. And in fact, in an industry that has had such a miserable record of hiring black head coaches and retaining them, if they have one or two bad years, they're gone. Like that's been the history for a lot of coaches. In an industry like that, and in a league like that, you should be trying to do both. You can walk and chew gum at the same time. You can find amazing coaches and also diversify the talent pool. So I felt like Kraft was sort of trying to finesse that. And I appreciated that Mayo was like, look, I notice color and I think you got to notice color. So that's a huge deal. And I think we ought to embrace that. Contrary to what Elon Musk has been saying on Twitter lately, DEI is not counter to merit, right? DEI efforts work hand in hand with merit because it's premised on the idea that in the absence of deliberate efforts to bring in black and brown folk when it comes to race, women when it comes to sex or gender, if you don't make deliberate efforts, those folks will continue to be overlooked even when they are the ones with the merit, right? They will continue to be excluded. And the NFL is a great example of that. It is an old boys network par excellence. It is probably one of the oldest boy networks in the country. And a lot of times owners hire people they're comfortable with, who tend to look a lot like them, who remind them of their own, of their own experiences and that they culturally resonate with. They may not be overt bigots, but they tend to close ranks, right? And they tend to sort of go with who they know. The fact that the Patriots didn't do that, especially given the history of Boston area sports, which is anyone who's played ball in Boston historically knows the legacy of that town. Now, much of it we know from baseball and basketball. We know what Bill Russell said about the Celtics and playing there and how constantly he was bombarded, even by locals for whom he was helping win games, right? Bombarded with racism, treated like crap. We know in baseball that the owner of the Red Sox was such a racist, notoriously racist, that he actually passed on hiring Willie Mays to play for the Red Sox when Mays came into the league because he didn't want a black player. So he turned down arguably the greatest all-around ball player in the history of the game and kept losing for years with a bunch of white guys who weren't nearly as good as a lot of the folks that they overlooked. And they were the last team to actually integrate. And they didn't do it, I think, until the early 60s, maybe late 50s, but took them a really long time. And so for the Patriots to make that step is a great step. Now, it's also a relatively safe call because this is a guy with a long history with the Patriots. He played for them. He's been a coach with them. So they love him there. I'm not sure that it was and this is not meant to disrespect Jerry Mayo at all. He's a fantastic coach, and I think he'll be a really good coach for the Patriots. But I'm saying that it's not, he got someone who also already is liked pretty well, by Patriots Nation. Right. That makes it a lot easier. But that's still good. It's still a good move, and it does not mean that the Patriots are just checking boxes, right? Look, the Patriots have too long a history of success to just go around and check boxes. They're not going to hire somebody to be the coach of that team. This is not like the Patriots, 30 years ago when they weren't that good. There was a period of time when they were, in the playoffs, not in the playoffs. There was a period of time when they weren't nearly as good as they became during the Belichick years and Tom Brady years. And they're not going to go back to that. They're not going to hire someone that they think is going to take them back to like relative mediocrity, which is what they were for a period of time. So it was obviously a merit move, but it was also a legitimate move to say, you know what, we've got these amazing possible head coaches that we are constantly overlooking. They rarely get a shot, and it's time to give them a shot. Those two things can both be true at the same time.
I love how you've been pointed out on social media, the people who clearly, there was no merit considered when they got their job, specifically some of Trump's lawyers and other people. There are so many white people that just keep failing forward and keep on winning regardless of how much they fail, from sports to just about every other industry.
The Trump family is the greatest example of failing up that you could possibly have. There's no way that a black business person with 6 or 7 bankruptcies, whose every sort of side gig that they touch, every little company they tried to start basically failed, with the exception of the developer stuff, which he made some money on, but also has lost tons of money. Nobody with that record in business, nobody that started a university that was as much of a scam as Trump University, if they'd have been black or brown, could have considered themselves a legitimate, viable contender for the presidency. Just like, look, in any black bankers that destroyed the American economy the way the white bankers did in the era of the Great Recession, right? They made off with $12.5 trillion or lost $12.5 trillion worth of value, which was about 20% of the accumulated net worth of the United States at the time, which it took centuries to build up, and they wiped it out in about 18 months. If that had been black folks who did that on Wall Street, black folks wouldn't be able to get jobs at a bank as a teller anymore, let alone as like a day trader on Wall Street. They wouldn't be getting, and they wouldn't be working behind the glass to take your measly deposit when you walk into the bank. But white folks did it. They didn't go to jail. They got their bonuses, and ain't nobody saying, well, I don't know about these white boys coming out of MBA programs working on Wall Street. We might want to check them. They might be criminals. So white failure upward, whether it's Jared Kushner, whether it's the Trumps, whether it's Alina Habba, this person who it's like moot court with her. It's like she's in 9th grade mock trial competition and she didn't read the evidence law book.
Yeah, she's not very good.
She's horrible, but she's raked in $2.5 million for her firm by representing Trump, because this is one of those bills that he pays. He pays it with campaign money. He pays it with campaign contributions, not his own money. But so Alina Habba doesn't care that she's not good. She doesn't care that she's likely to lose this case for Donald Trump in the eyes of the jury, because she's getting paid either way. That's the standard of white mediocrity. You can be mediocre and you can still become incredibly wealthy, incredibly famous, and relatively powerful in ways that people of color just simply can't.
Very well said. Lastly, you mentioned this, but I wanted to just talk about this. There's this huge controversy now over DEI as it relates. First, we've had to confront these people. I personally have had to confront them at the school board meetings. They equate things like CRT, DEI, and anytime they hear an acronym, they get really scared, even if they don't know what it means. And now it's being talked about a lot when it comes to the corporate workforce and so on. And this blew up a couple weeks ago between Elon Musk and Mark Cuban, two powerful, wealthy white guys, including this other guy, Bill Ackman, this powerful, wealthy white guy who helped push out the Harvard president, a black woman. But basically, Mark Cuban is been advocating for and talking about the advantages of DEI, saying things like good businesses look where others don't. To find the employees that will put your business in the best possible position to succeed. By extending our hiring search to include them, we can find people that are more qualified. The loss, Mark Cuban said, the loss of DEI-phobic companies is my gain. And the reaction to that was, it's black people's faults that planes are crashing. They talked about DEI and the...
on that, and I had to remind everybody on Twitter of all the, and I did 7 minutes worth of research to find it. I'm sure if I'd spent 7 hours, I could have found plenty more. But, all these white folks who have been hauled off of planes because they were too drunk to fly them, showing up at the airport in their cups completely ripped from the night before. In the case of one Southwest pilot a few years ago, you may remember, infamously went into the cockpit, loaded, decided to take his clothes off because his co-pilot was a woman. And then he sat there and watched porn in the cockpit.
I don't think there's anything wrong with that, as long as he's a good pilot.
Well, but he wasn't, and it was awful. And she sued, of course, both him and Southwest. And the point being, that's the kind of stuff, this idea that, yes, planes are crashing because of DEI programs in aviation. Listen, first of all, the high watermark for aviation incidents was 1994. That was well before any significant increase in DEI efforts. It was overwhelmingly white men even now, let alone then, where it was probably 98% of the fleet of pilots. So that was when the planes were crashing. I mean, we haven't really had, thank God, knock on wood, I hope that continues to be the case, major air disasters in a few years, at least not in this country. And so I'm not saying that that's because of DEI. I'm not saying because it's the diversification of the pilot force. I'm just saying you can't make these arguments with a straight face, and yet they do. And in the case of the Alaska Air, the flight that just had the door sucked out into space at 16,000 feet or whatever, that's not the pilot. First of all, the pilot doesn't do with the structural integrity of the plane. So the idea that you've got people in the machinists union, what are they, super woke? I've spoken to the Boeing machinists union before. Let me suggest to you, they've tried to do some diversity work, but it's a lot of white guys. It's pretty overwhelmingly white guys, like big, burly, scary to me because I'm 5'8", white guys. They're very nice. They were very nice to me when I spoke, But I remember going and giving a speech at the Boeing Machinists Union in Seattle and doing a pro-DEI affirmative action thing. And it wasn't like they were all making me an honorary member of their union. They were not at all pleased. So the idea that they're all down with, sort of woke machinist work, I don't know even what that would be, is not true. So these arguments, though, are what the right does to try to scare white people, to basically say, if we do DEI, it's not just that we're lowering standards, you might die.
Yeah, no,
right?
I mean, it's exactly that. It's exactly that.
And the implicit argument is, but they're usually not courageous enough to say it. The implicit argument is the reason that these black people, and that's usually who they're talking about, or that these women, regardless of race, are not in these positions already is because they're just not as good. If they were as good, they'd already be there. So if you make a deliberate effort to include, it sort of get why a person might believe that. If you buy into the notion of meritocracy, right? If you buy into the idea, and we've all been trained to buy into it, that whoever works hard can succeed. And if you work hard, you can make it. Then you do believe rugged individualism. You believe that the hierarchies are natural. You believe that rich people are just where they are because they're just that smart. White men disproportionately at the top of those hierarchies. Well, they just must be that smart. And therefore, by definition, you don't believe what Mark Cuban recognizes, which is that there's all this undiscovered talent. If you're Elon, you think, no, talent will always rise to the top. And I can tell objectively who the best person is. And there is no systemic obstacle. And there are no old boys networks. And there are no, sort of systemic and structural impediments to the best coming forward and walking through the door of my company. But there are a lot of people who have I've used the analogy before. We sometimes talk about inequality and racism as a racetrack where some people have got a 5-lap head start. Well, that's one way of conceiving it. But this is worse, right? There are people who don't even know where the track is. Right? Who do not know there is a race that they can even potentially join. And if I don't know where the track is, or if I don't know when the race starts, I can't even get in the competition. I can't even train. Why would I train for a competition that I don't know it exists? And I don't know anyone there at, let's say, in this case, a company, right? So DEI efforts, which, to be honest, I mean, I've criticized them for years for being pretty weak tea. A lot of times they don't do a whole lot. But the idea that they are wholesale eliminating opportunity for white men is absolutely preposterous in light of who has what and who doesn't in this country. You've got black folks right now with college degrees who are still about 70 to 80% more likely to be unemployed than white folks with college degrees.
Great point.
Now, if DEI were resulting in all the jobs going to black people and white people, that wouldn't be true, right? If a black person had a degree and a white person had a degree and DEI was always tilting in favor of black people, would they be getting all those jobs? But they're not. White households headed by high school dropouts have about 20% more net worth on average than black households headed by college graduates. So DEI is not even fundamentally changing the systemic structural inequality, but it makes a great talking point for right-wing politicians and talking heads who want to scare white people about the changes that are underfoot in this society and make them believe that there's this quote unquote great replacement of white people by less qualified, less intelligent black and brown people, and that it's somehow going to harm America, as opposed to improve this country by making sure that talent is tapped that otherwise might be overlooked, which is ultimately going to be better for everyone. Honestly.
So well explained, which is why big companies and institutions bring you in to explain these things. It shouldn't be so hard, but you do it better than almost everybody. Tim, I can't thank you enough. I'll let you go, but another amazing conversation. I appreciate so much your time and knowledge and wisdom and covering all these recent issues that we're trying to understand and unpack. Thank you, my friend. That was awesome, as always.
Thank you.
All right, there he goes, Tim Wise, everybody. Tim Jacob Wise. Go look him up. Go follow him. All the information is in the show links to link to Tim and say hello. Let him know you appreciate him joining me. Review this podcast. Join us in Vegas. Subscribe to support the program, and those are my final messages to you. I will be out with another episode tomorrow, but I appreciate you supporting me today. Thank you very, very much. And that is it. I'm going to stop talking and let John Carroll sing us out, as he will in Las Vegas, March 22nd and 23rd. See you there.
trees, you got to stand up. Hey, you've been sitting so long, you got the creaky knees, you got to stand up. Stand up. I think you're driving wheels with leaking grease. Boy, you better stand up. Stand up. Well, there's a whole lot more of us who know what's right. They'll keep right on ignoring us if we keep sitting tight. You got to open up the window to let in some light. You got to stand up. That's right. We got to rise up. You got to stand up. You got to stare the devil straight in the eye. We got to let him know it's his turn to go. See it clear and all you hear is a lie. Don't get up off of your butt, get down off of your fence. Even if it ain't a very friendly audience, well, they'll begin to listen when you start making sense. And you stand up. Stand up. No need to point your rifle to defend your town. Just stand up. Stand up. You know they can't deny you what you're laying down. Boy, you better stand up. Stand up. Show your face of every color, yellow, black, red, and brown. She's the place where every lost child will finally be found. There's only one thing to do before we stand our ground, and that's stand up. Stand up. Well, the founding fathers saw a land for all. They had to stand up. They had to stand up. They had a keen imagination for a crystal ball, drawing all the plans of stand up. But all they had to go on was the time they were in, with other causes for laws, and since they weren't even sin, they knew that change was gonna come before the change would begin. They had to stand up. All right, they had to stand up. We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. We got to let him know it's his time to go, and make it clear when all we hear is a lie. Why you lying awake wondering where the money all went? It'll be the cost of freedom that'll go unspent. You can see him flee the scene of that experiment if you stand up. All right. We got to speak up, we got to reach up, and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up, you got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it but now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up, show obedience to the voice inside, and listen well and it'll tell you not to run and hide. It says stand up.